Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Garrett, 28, and I've spent most of my life navigating a family that excels at turning every occasion into a performance, one where I somehow always end up as the punchline. My birthday had never been the serene, simple thing I imagined as a kid. Growing up, my parents and my cousins thrived on drama, subtle digs, and hierarchy. Who got the biggest piece of cake? Whose accomplishments mattered? Who sat at the good table? I thought turning 28 might finally bring a shift. Maybe this year I could have a birthday that felt like it was really mine, not a showcase for everyone else. I was wrong. The trouble started the moment I arrived at the restaurant my parents insisted on booking for my dinner. I had suggested a quiet, low-key place, something modest with comfort food I actually liked, but my dad waved that off immediately. "Garrett, birthdays aren't about you," he said, with that smirk that always makes me feel like I'm failing even when I'm standing perfectly still. So, here we were, a restaurant that looked more like a gala hall than a dining room. Gold-trimmed mirrors reflecting the candlelight and chandeliers that sparkled obnoxiously, lighting up the room in a way that made everything feel staged. I walked in with a polite smile, telling myself I could survive this. My parents were already seated, whispering to each other like conspirators, and my cousin Tyler was there too. He's 31, always had a knack for making everyone feel small without ever raising his voice. When I entered, he straightened up and gave me that slow, deliberate look that said, without words, "I am superior, and you're just background noise." The kind of look that's funny if you see it on TV, but crushing in real life. I tried to shake it off as I approached the table, hoping maybe the mood would settle when we sat down. It didn't. The first real sting came when Tyler leaned back, smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, and said loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "You can't sit here. This is for VIP guests." He gestured with exaggerated disdain to the stiff plastic chair in the corner, a chair that looked like it belonged in a break room at an airport lounge, not a place that was supposedly celebrating me. There was a pause, just long enough for everyone to notice my hesitation. I froze, my stomach twisting. A couple of my relatives snickered. I forced a laugh, trying to keep it light, but inside I could feel the blood rushing to my ears, my chest tightening with frustration. "Thanks, Tyler," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'll just take the corner then." I tried to make it sound casual, even playful, but the laughter from the table made me realize it wasn't going to stop there. My parents didn't intervene. My mom smiled faintly, her hand gently resting on my dad's arm as if to say, "Let him deal with it. It's character building," while my dad chuckled, the kind of chuckle that always makes me feel like I'm the joke. I slid into the hard chair, my back straight, pretending it didn't bother me that my birthday celebration had already been reduced to a spectacle of humiliation. The waiter came by, menu in hand, and I was relieved for a moment, thinking at least food could distract me from the absurdity. That relief lasted about 20 seconds before I realized Tyler had nudged the menu toward the center, tilting it so I could see the desserts section first. That's when I froze again. The prices were insane. Not just a little overpriced, insane. There was one dessert, a chocolate dome with gold leaf and spun sugar. That cost $2,200. $2,200. My jaw went slack, and I could feel a flush creeping across my face. I glanced at Tyler. He was grinning now, triumphant, as if he had orchestrated the entire scene. "Impressive, isn't it?" Tyler said, his tone mocking, like he was testing my limits. I told him to save the best for the VIPs. The table erupted in soft laughter, that kind of polite, patronizing laughter that cuts just as sharply as outright ridicule. I wanted to tell him off. I wanted to stand up and tell everyone I didn't need their approval, that my birthday didn't have to involve gold, glass, or $2,200 desserts to matter. But I didn't. I just leaned back in my chair and said quietly, almost to myself but loud enough for the waiter to hear, "Not my celebration." The silence that followed was different from the usual awkward pauses. It wasn't polite. It wasn't polite laughter. It was sharp, like a blade cutting through the room. My parents exchanged a glance that said nothing to me, but spoke volumes to Tyler. He froze, momentarily losing his smug composure. My cousins blinked, trying to gauge if I'd really just said that. And the waiter, bless him, looked at me like he'd seen someone try to defuse a bomb with a toothpick. It was the first crack in the facade, the first moment where my voice, quiet as it was, disrupted the entire little ecosystem my family had built around superiority, entitlement, and control. But it didn't end the night. Not by a long shot. If anything, it marked the beginning of a war I hadn't even realized I was in. Every course that followed, every conversation, every toast was now layered with tension. Tyler's comments became sharper, subtler, tiny barbs disguised as jokes, asides meant to undermine me while making it look like casual teasing. My parents, ever the enablers, smiled indulgently at his antics, reinforcing the hierarchy that I had spent my life trying to navigate without ever realizing it was rigged. By the time the appetizers arrived, I could feel the familiar coil of frustration in my chest. The polite mask I had worn so carefully was starting to slip. I wanted to confront them, to scream at everyone that this wasn't a VIP dinner for them. It was my birthday. But I stayed quiet. Part of me was still trying to survive the night. Part of me already planning how to turn this embarrassment into something else, something that didn't leave me sitting in a stiff chair while everyone else laughed at my expense. As the plates clinked and the chatter buzzed around me, I realized just how deeply this pattern ran. Tyler wasn't just cruel for the sake of cruelty. He had been trained, molded by the same system my parents had set up, to always prioritize himself, to elevate every minor advantage into a spectacle. And me? I had spent so long trying to fit into their system, trying to be the good sport, that I hadn't noticed the stakes until this moment. By the time the main course was served, I wasn't just irritated, I was calculating. Every laugh, every glance, every sideways comment was fuel. I could feel it shaping a strategy in my mind, a way to shift the power balance, quietly but decisively. My parents might have thought I was meek, Tyler might have thought I was a pushover, but there was a part of me that thrived on planning, on waiting for the right moment to strike. I leaned back in my chair, picking at my food without real appetite, letting Tyler prattle on about who got the best slice of birthday cake last year, all the while imagining the eventual payoff. By the time the dessert menu was finally placed in front of the table in full, with every extravagant, overpriced option displayed as though it were a trophy for the elite, I knew one thing. This night wasn't going to end quietly. Not for me, not for Tyler, and definitely not for anyone who thought my birthday was their stage. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I knew that if they thought they were winning tonight, they were very, very wrong. And that's when I saw it, the tiniest glint of opportunity. Tyler, puffed up with self-satisfaction, leaning back as if he owned the room, didn't notice that the waiter had just set down a second dessert menu. One that, thanks to a last-minute reservation mix-up, had included a private tasting selection, a mistake in their system that Tyler was blissfully unaware of. My pulse quickened. I leaned back, pretending to survey the menu casually, but inside, a plan was already forming. Not a dramatic outburst, not yet. Something quieter. Something that would make them remember this birthday long after they laughed at the stiff chair in the corner. By the time the main course was done and the plates cleared, I was already simmering with a mix of frustration, disbelief, and something dangerously close to determination. My parents had spent the evening passing subtle glances, nods, and half-smiles to Tyler that made it clear they were on his side. Even small victories of mine, like managing to order a dish I actually liked or making a joke that landed well, were shrugged off with a "that's nice" glance, as though I were a minor character in my own life. Tyler, on the other hand, thrived in the spotlight. Every comment he made was designed to elevate him, and I could feel the table subtly bending to his rhythm. The worst part was how effortlessly everyone just let it happen. It wasn't even entertaining for them to tease me. They were actively enjoying reinforcing the hierarchy. I tried to focus on the little things that kept me sane. The breadbasket in front of me, the subtle textures of the food, the way the lighting made the gold on the chandeliers gleam like something out of a movie. I tried to convince myself this wasn't a battle I needed to fight openly yet, that patience could be a weapon. But patience is a fragile shield when you're surrounded by people who wield entitlement like a weapon. It started small. Tyler nudging my plate with his elbow when I wasn't looking, just enough to make the food slide slightly to the side. My mom interjecting whenever I tried to defend myself from a joke or a criticism, her voice soft and polite, but always siding with him. "Oh, Garrett, don't be so sensitive," she said, with that tone that always made me feel like I was the one overreacting. My dad laughed along, and suddenly I was the odd one out, the problem to be managed. The injustice of it made my stomach twist, and yet I stayed quiet, sipping my drink, nodding politely, pretending nothing hurt. Then came the toast. My uncle, who'd barely met me in the last year, stood up with a glass in hand. To Tyler, of course, who's always been the shining example in this family. And, to Garrett, who, well, he's here too. The laughter that followed was softer than the snickers earlier, but no less cruel. I forced a smile, clinking my glass lightly with his, all the while feeling the tight coil in my chest twist tighter. I wanted to leave. I wanted to storm out and never look back, but the thought of walking away before the night even reached its peak felt like surrender, and something in me refused to surrender to Tyler. Then came the gift moment. My parents had this habit of presenting birthday gifts in a public, performative way. They called it a tradition, but in reality, it was another opportunity to assert control. Tyler, of course, got the first gift. The wrapping was ornate, the item clearly expensive. My dad made a long speech about how thoughtful and clever Tyler was, how he deserved the best of everything, how lucky we all were to have him in the family. I felt my jaw tighten as Tyler grinned, soaking in the attention. The subtle applause from everyone was like salt on an open wound. And then my turn. I wasn't expecting much. A card, maybe something small, just enough to acknowledge my birthday without it being a spectacle. That would have been enough. But instead, my parents handed me a thin envelope, not a box, not something that could even hold a real present. I opened it, expecting perhaps a gift card or a note. Inside was a single, cold statement. "We've decided not to give you a birthday gift this year. You don't appreciate what you have." I froze. My mind raced. Did I misread it? No. Everyone at the table was watching my reaction, and I could see Tyler smirking at the corner of his mouth, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. My parents' faces were neutral, unreadable, the kind of masks people wear when they want to maintain control while delivering a knife in the back. The silence in the room pressed down on me, and for the first time that evening, I felt a surge of raw, unfiltered anger. "You what?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected, but I could feel my hands shaking. "You didn't get me a gift?" My dad shrugged, casual, almost bored. "We thought it was appropriate, given how you behave sometimes. Gifts should go to those who deserve them." Tyler snorted. "Yeah, Garrett, maybe next year you'll figure it out." He leaned back, arms crossed, clearly enjoying my discomfort. I wanted to stand up and punch him, to rip the smugness off his face, but I didn't. I sat there, pretending to compose myself, feeling the anger building into something solid, almost tactile in my chest. And then the dessert arrived. Not mine, Tyler's. The $2,200 chocolate dome sat on the table in front of him like a trophy, glittering and absurd, with the waiter presenting it as though it were the crown jewel of the evening. I noticed the waiter glance at me briefly, eyebrows raised, as if aware of the ridiculousness of it all. I leaned back in my chair, the phrase, "not my celebration," replaying in my mind like a quiet promise. But it wasn't enough. Tyler wasn't done. He leaned over and tapped the dome with his fork, then looked at me. "You'd never understand, Garrett. This is for someone who knows what they want, and who actually earns it." He laughed softly, that patronizing tone I had learned to hate. My parents chuckled along. My cousins chimed in. I felt the world narrowing around me, like the air itself had turned into an opponent. I thought about standing up, about walking out and leaving them to their performance, but something in me, maybe pride, maybe rage, kept me rooted in my chair. I watched every detail, every micro-expression, every way Tyler manipulated the room. And then I noticed it, a mistake. My parents had left their phones on the table, unlocked. Tyler's email notification popped up briefly on my mom's screen, flashing a line that said, "Check the gift allocation for Garrett. Need approval on the budget." My heart skipped. I glanced again, this time catching a clearer view. There it was. The amount they were supposed to spend on my gift, and the reason it was denied. It wasn't that I was unworthy. It was that Tyler had argued, successfully, to keep it for himself. Something inside me snapped. Not a scream, not a confrontation. Something quieter, colder, more deliberate. I realized that the whole evening, every insult, every snicker, every display of favoritism had been orchestrated by Tyler and silently endorsed by my parents. The betrayal wasn't small, it was monumental. They had turned my birthday into a spectacle to reinforce their own hierarchy, to make me feel powerless, to assert dominance. And they had succeeded up until this moment. I sat back in my chair, breathing slowly, my eyes tracking Tyler as he reveled in his victory. My mind, which had been roiling with frustration, now began to calculate. The night was far from over. There was still dessert, still drinks, still the awkward toasts and conversations. And somewhere, in the background of every polite smile, every laugh, there was a way to turn the tables. I didn't know how yet, but I could feel the gears shifting, the plan forming. Tyler had underestimated me, my parents had miscalculated, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the tables could, and would, turn. By the time I excused myself to the restroom, ostensibly to freshen up, I was trembling slightly, not from anger alone, but from the adrenaline of knowing that the night's story wasn't finished. I washed my hands, staring at my reflection, the fluorescent light harsh against the tension in my face. I saw the mask I had worn for so long, the one that kept me polite, deferential, unnoticed, and I realized I could drop it. Not today, not yet, but soon. I could feel the slow burn of strategy forming, and it felt like a pulse in my veins, a rhythm I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. When I returned to the table, Tyler was mid-story, bragging about some trivial success to my aunts and uncles, everyone laughing at his charm. I slid back into my chair quietly, letting the scene play out. I was calm now, coldly aware of every motion, every glance. And then, just as the waiter began to clear the last crumbs of the main course, my dad leaned over to Tyler with a whispered comment, something I caught only partially. "You really think you've got him boxed in, huh?" I didn't respond, didn't react, but inside, my mind was already moving, weaving possibilities. The betrayal had been laid bare. The humiliation had been delivered. And now, quietly, I began to plot. Because if this night was supposed to be about Tyler's ego and my parents' approval, it was about to become about me, and they had no idea what was coming. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles, half-hearted conversations, and Tyler soaking up the attention like a sponge. Every laugh, every nod, every small glance of approval from my parents felt like a jab, a confirmation that they had succeeded in diminishing me. The betrayal wasn't just about the gift anymore. It was about the entire pattern of my life, the way I'd been conditioned to accept small humiliations while they celebrated every victory of others. By the time I returned home that night, I felt like I had been chewed up and spat out. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, head bowed, trying to breathe through the crushing weight of everything. I spent the first few hours after the party in quiet self-recrimination. My mind replayed the dinner scene over and over, each insult, each subtle condescension, magnified until it was unbearable. I thought about my parents, who had passively let Tyler dictate the flow of the night, and I thought about him, grinning, certain he had won yet again. My stomach churned with rage and embarrassment, a cocktail of feelings that left me hollow and exhausted. I hated feeling so powerless, hated that I had let them define my self-worth for so long. But as I sat in the dim light of my apartment, something shifted. Not a dramatic, overnight transformation, but a quiet, simmering realization. They hadn't broken me. Tyler might have humiliated me, my parents might have enabled it, but the real power hadn't been in their hands, it was in mine. For the first time in a long time, I started thinking about myself, not as someone who needed their approval, but as someone who had been ignoring his own agency for too long. That night, alone in the silence, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let their entitlement define my life anymore. I wasn't going to be the passive character in their performance. The next morning, I woke with a strange clarity. I felt tired, yes, but also alive in a way I hadn't in years. I started small. I cleaned my apartment meticulously, something that always helped me think, letting order replace the chaos that Tyler and my family had imposed on my mind. I started reading again, immersing myself in stories of people who had taken control of their own lives, who had reclaimed dignity from unfair circumstances. Every page, every word felt like a tiny spark, igniting a sense of possibility. Then I turned my attention to work. I had a decent job, but nothing extraordinary, something stable that paid the bills and left me drained at the end of the day. I decided to take risks, to push myself beyond the boundaries I had unconsciously accepted. I stayed late, volunteered for projects no one else wanted, quietly building skills, contacts, and a reputation that wasn't based on family politics but on merit. The shift wasn't instant. There were long nights, moments when exhaustion and self-doubt clawed at me, whispering that I would never escape the shadow Tyler and my family had cast. But each small achievement, each recognition from colleagues, strengthened my resolve. Socially, I withdrew from family gatherings. I didn't broadcast my absence. I didn't make a scene. I just stopped participating in the theater they created. At first, it felt lonely. I missed familiar faces, even if they were the source of pain. But slowly, I started connecting with people who valued me for myself, not as a prop or punchline. I built friendships that were reciprocal, conversations that were honest, laughter that wasn't at my expense. For the first time, I realized that my world could be larger than the small, performative stage my family had always demanded. Tyler, predictably, didn't notice my absence at first. He thrived on immediate feedback, on visible reactions, and without them, he seemed to falter in small ways. My parents occasionally asked about me, but their concern was tinged with confusion, almost irritation, as if my autonomy was inconvenient. I didn't respond beyond polite nods and neutral replies. I realized that they expected me to continue performing, to feed their narrative of control, but I was no longer participating. I was quietly reclaiming my life, step by deliberate step. The tipping point came about 6 months after that disastrous birthday. I had thrown myself into a personal project, a small business idea I had been nurturing in secret. It wasn't glamorous at first. It was a one-person operation, long hours, early mornings, a constant balancing act between work and the project. But it was mine. Every success, every small victory, every satisfied customer felt like a reclamation of agency. Tyler, of course, remained oblivious. He was wrapped up in his own successes, flaunting status and possessions while I quietly built something sustainable, something that wouldn't rely on anyone else's approval. Then came the night I realized just how far I had come. I had been invited to a local networking event, one that Tyler would never attend because he preferred spaces where admiration was guaranteed, not earned. I walked in with my head high, confident in my own achievements, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was being measured against someone else. People approached me, not because I was related to anyone or because I played the game, but because I had something of value to offer. I spoke, they listened, I laughed, and it was genuine. I felt seen, not performed for, not tolerated, not dismissed. And yet, the shadow of Tyler and my family lingered. I knew they wouldn't stay oblivious forever. The thought didn't frighten me, it exhilarated me. I realized that the power balance had shifted quietly but irrevocably. I wasn't defined by their entitlement or favoritism. I wasn't trapped by the narratives they had tried to impose. The betrayal, the humiliation, the $2,200 dessert, they were no longer symbols of my inferiority. They were markers of the world I had left behind, a world I was now free from. I didn't seek revenge immediately. I didn't need to. What I did was meticulous, subtle, and deliberate. I documented achievements, built credibility, and cultivated an image that couldn't be undermined by casual jabs or whispered criticisms. I learned to anticipate Tyler's moves, to see his vulnerabilities in the same way he had always spotted mine. I watched, waited, and grew. My parents continued their performances, but their approval no longer mattered. The quiet satisfaction of knowing I was succeeding in my own right was more intoxicating than any applause or praise they could offer. There were moments when I faltered. Old habits, ingrained politeness, the instinct to defer, it all bubbled up when I least expected it. But I caught myself every time. I practiced saying no, practicing boundaries, learning to value my own time and effort. I realized that strength wasn't about confronting Tyler head-on in the moment. It was about ensuring that when the moment of confrontation finally came, I would be in a position of undeniable power. I would not need to shout or demand attention. My achievements, my control, and my agency would speak for themselves. And slowly, quietly, the world outside of my family's theater started responding. My project grew. Opportunities multiplied. People sought me out for advice, for partnership, for collaboration. I began to understand that I had spent so much of my life trying to gain approval in the wrong places. Tyler had thrived on immediate gratification, on visible victories, on control in the small, performative spaces of family life. I thrived on substance, on patience, on skill, and on strategy. By the time my next birthday approached, I felt different. Not cocky, not arrogant, but powerful, steady, and deliberate. I didn't need a party to validate me. I didn't need a gold-trimmed restaurant or a $2,200 dessert to prove my worth. And yet, a part of me wondered, Tyler would never let this go. My parents would never stop favoring him. The next encounter would be inevitable, and I knew that when it came, I needed to be ready, not reactive, not emotional, but precise. It was in this space, balance between recovery and strategy, between anger and patience, that I found a clarity I had never experienced before. The betrayal had been crushing, yes, but it had also been the catalyst I didn't know I needed. I wasn't just rebuilding. I was constructing something stronger, something that Tyler and my family couldn't touch. And for the first time in my life, I realized that revenge wouldn't be about snapping back in anger. It would be about a calculated dismantling of their illusions, one move at a time, from a position of undeniable strength. And so I waited, not idle, not passive, but carefully, deliberately. The stage was set. Tyler was still wrapped in his entitlement, oblivious to the quiet storm building beneath him. My parents were still performing their roles, unaware that the narrative had already shifted. I had hit rock bottom, yes, but from there, I had risen, stronger, sharper, and ready. And when the time came, I knew exactly how I would make them remember that my story was no longer theirs to control. By the time my next birthday rolled around, I was no longer the same person who had sat in that stiff corner chair, humiliated and overlooked. Months of painstaking work, careful observation, and quiet victories had transformed me in ways my family couldn't yet recognize. I had grown stronger, smarter, and more deliberate, and the seed of revenge was no longer a vague fantasy. It was a blueprint. But I knew that revenge was an art, not a rush. It had to be calculated, precise, and unstoppable. Impatience was my greatest enemy, and I couldn't afford to give Tyler or my parents even the slightest hint of my intentions. The first step was observation. I started attending family events again, but this time with a plan. I was no longer reactive. I didn't sit quietly in the background. I sat where I pleased, laughed where it suited me, and watched. Every glance, every whispered comment, every subtle expression became data. Tyler hadn't changed. He still dominated the conversations, still thrived on approval, still nudged and prodded everyone around him to reinforce his self-image. But now, I could see the cracks. He had blind spots, moments when he assumed loyalty where it didn't exist, confidence where there was only ignorance. And my parents? They still fawned over him, but I noticed patterns in their behavior. The way my mom subtly manipulated conversations to give him the upper hand, the way my dad deferred to him on small decisions, the moments of hypocrisy when they punished me for minor slip-ups while celebrating Tyler's antics. All of it was a map, and I intended to follow it. I started quietly assembling allies. Not obvious ones, not people who would take sides openly, but individuals who had long observed the family dynamics and quietly sympathized with me. Friends who had witnessed the subtle favoritism, colleagues who had seen me unfairly judged, even distant relatives who had felt Tyler's manipulations firsthand. Each person became a node in my web, someone who could provide insight, corroboration, or leverage when the time came. I was building a network of quiet witnesses, of people whose testimony would lend credibility to my eventual moves. Simultaneously, I built my personal arsenal. My business had grown steadily, quietly, without fanfare, and now it was gaining traction in ways that would make Tyler's head spin if he ever realized. I tracked finances meticulously, documenting every success, every client interaction, Every small victory that Tyler and my parents had once assumed was irrelevant. I kept evidence of their favoritism, subtle yet undeniable. Emails, conversations, invitations, and dismissals. Nothing illegal, nothing reckless, just facts. The truth would be my weapon, and I intended to wield it with precision. Meanwhile, I began planting seeds of doubt within the family without ever revealing my hand. I started small, subtle remarks in casual conversation, anecdotes that hinted at Tyler's overconfidence or poor judgment. I asked questions that made my parents reconsider his decisions, without ever appearing confrontational. The goal was to erode the pedestal they had built around him, quietly and slowly, so that when the moment came, the collapse would seem inevitable. Every smile I offered, every joke I allowed myself, was a calculated part of the performance. Friendly, harmless, unthreatening. But beneath it, the gears of strategy were turning. I also studied timing. I realized that Tyler thrived on predictable routines, family dinners, holidays, and gatherings where he could manipulate the narrative. I planned my moves around these patterns, identifying the exact moments when his ego would be most vulnerable. I watched how he interacted with staff, friends, and acquaintances, noticing the subtle ways he sought validation. I studied his weaknesses, the small cracks in his armor that even he didn't recognize. Confidence built on entitlement always has a breaking point, and I intended to find it. One particularly instructive moment came during a cousin's wedding. Tyler, as usual, was at the center of attention, delivering toasts, charming relatives, and taking credit for minor organizational decisions. My parents hung on every word, smiling indulgently while I observed. But then I noticed a series of errors: a misplaced bouquet, a seating arrangement that confused guests, and a catering miscommunication that Tyler tried to cover up with charm rather than competence. I took mental notes, recording each small failure, each moment where his confidence didn't match reality. These were the threads I could pull later, strands of evidence that would unravel the image he had so carefully curated. I also began refining my persona in front of the family. Gone was the timid, polite Garrett who had allowed himself to be sidelined. I was confident, calm, and self-assured without being brash. I laughed when appropriate, interjected with well-timed comments, and demonstrated competence in ways that subtly contrasted Tyler's exaggerated self-importance. I was patient, biding my time, letting him continue to misjudge me. Every interaction was a test, a way to reinforce his arrogance while secretly strengthening my position. And then came the tipping point in my planning: the discovery of the dessert menu incident from last year. Tyler had no idea I remembered the $2,200 chocolate dome, the deliberate exclusion, the way my parents had silently endorsed it. But I remembered. I studied it, analyzed it, and used it as a reminder. Every slight, every humiliation, every act of favoritism was cataloged. I understood now that revenge wouldn't just be about a single moment. It would be about correcting the narrative that had defined my life for decades. Tyler had grown up believing he was untouchable, that the world, and my family, would always bend to his ego. That assumption would be his undoing. I began drafting scenarios, contingency plans, and triggers. Every family gathering, every interaction, every potential public moment became a chessboard. I considered who would be present, who would notice, and who could amplify the impact of each move. I mapped out the emotional responses, the predictable defenses, and the inevitable surprises. Each plan had multiple layers, designed so that if one aspect failed, another would succeed. By the end of these sessions, I had the beginnings of a master plan. Not chaotic, not vengeful in the moment, but strategic, deliberate, and devastating in its potential. Simultaneously, I nurtured my confidence and resilience in private. I took time for myself, for reflection, for reinforcing my self-worth. I started exercising more, pushing myself physically, because I realized that strength, both mental and physical, would be critical when the time came. I journaled meticulously, documenting every thought, every insight, every lesson learned from Tyler's behavior and my parents' complicity. Each entry was a reminder. The power I sought wasn't about confrontation alone. It was about preparation, foresight, and patience. I also began testing small pieces of my plan. I planted subtle doubts in Tyler's mind, minor hints that not everything was as secure as he believed. I would mention past mistakes in a casual tone, remark on overlooked responsibilities, or express confidence in areas he assumed he controlled. Each remark was calibrated to undermine without provoking suspicion. Slowly, imperceptibly, the pedestal he had built for himself began to wobble. He didn't notice, of course. Arrogance blinds the entitled, but I did, and it thrilled me. And then came the ultimate realization. The perfect opportunity would present itself not through aggression, not through confrontation, but through inevitability. Tyler had created his own vulnerabilities. His need for recognition, his reliance on approval, his assumption of superiority. All of it could be turned against him. I just needed patience, timing, and the courage to execute when the moment was right. The night of my next birthday would be the stage, not because I sought spectacle, but because the circumstances had aligned to give me leverage I had never had before. By the time I finally sat back in my apartment, reviewing my notes and mental rehearsals, I felt a strange combination of excitement and calm. The years of humiliation, the betrayals, the countless subtle insults, they had all led me here. I had rebuilt my life quietly, deliberately, and with precision. I had allies, evidence, credibility, and confidence. Tyler was still blinded by his ego, my parents still unaware that the balance had shifted, and the family still oblivious to the storm that was quietly gathering at the edges of their awareness. The setup was complete. Every piece was in place. Every opportunity, every weakness, every calculated observation had been mapped. The pieces of the puzzle were ready to move. And the anticipation, the slow, patient anticipation, was almost more thrilling than the act itself. I knew that when the time came, the revelation, the shock, and the consequence would be undeniable. But the timing had to be perfect. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and it could all fall apart. So I waited, quietly, confidently, strategically. And in that waiting, in that meticulous preparation, I felt the first true thrill of control in my life. Not arrogance, not ego, control. Finally, the power that had always been withheld from me was within reach, and I would not squander it. The night I had been waiting for finally arrived. It wasn't advertised, it wasn't announced. There was no fanfare, no golden chandeliers, no whispers of who deserved what. It was just another family gathering, another opportunity to observe Tyler in his natural habitat. But this time, everything was different. I had done my homework. I knew the timing, I knew the weaknesses, and I knew exactly how to execute every part of the plan I had meticulously constructed. I arrived early, as always, taking in the layout of the room, the positioning of my parents, the casual placements of Tyler and his friends, the way the table had been set to create the illusion of hierarchy. Every detail was accounted for. My parents were already bustling around, placing drinks, adjusting napkins, rehearsing their polite smiles. Tyler, as predicted, was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, grin on his face, as if the universe owed him admiration at every turn. He had no idea that the universe, my universe, was about to shift dramatically. I took a deep breath and let myself relax. Calm was essential. The first part of the plan was subtle. I didn't need to confront Tyler directly or make a scene in front of everyone immediately. I started with the evidence I had been collecting: emails, records of favoritism, small financial discrepancies that had gone unnoticed, and moments when Tyler had failed publicly but my parents had covered for him. I placed them in order, labeled and easy to access, and kept them discreetly in my bag. The goal wasn't just exposure, it was undeniable demonstration. Every fact would speak for itself. The first move happened quietly. During the pre-dinner gathering, I casually mentioned a past oversight in Tyler's management of a family event, something small but verifiable. I phrased it as a neutral observation, not an accusation. My parents perked up immediately, their expressions shifting from casual amusement to curiosity. Tyler froze, instinctively defensive, and the subtle cracks began to show. He laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the seed had been planted. His usual charm didn't land, his confidence wavered, and I could see the doubt beginning to creep in. From there, I escalated carefully. I asked innocent questions about past decisions that Tyler had made in his self-aggrandizing speeches at previous gatherings, questions that seemed casual but highlighted inconsistencies in his stories. Each question was calculated, designed to cast a shadow on his credibility without making me the villain. My parents, who had always been quick to dismiss me, now leaned in, listening. They didn't realize that the narrative had already shifted. I let my calm, deliberate tone and subtle command of facts do the work. Then came the centerpiece. Dessert arrived, not extravagant this time, but symbolic. A selection that included the exact replica of the $2,200 chocolate dome from my birthday years ago, the one Tyler had monopolized and used to humiliate me. I had arranged it carefully with the restaurant, under the guise of celebrating the family gathering. As the desserts were placed on the table, I subtly guided the conversation toward that infamous night, asking questions about who had made the reservations, who had approved the menu, and who had decided which desserts were VIP only. Tyler's face went pale, his confidence cracking in real time. He opened his mouth to answer, but I interrupted softly, politely, with a calm smile. Actually, Tyler, I have the emails and receipts here. Everything is documented. It seems the $2,200 dessert was marked for me originally, but you argued to take it, and our parents agreed. Everyone remembers, don't they? The room went silent. My parents looked at each other, startled. My cousins shifted uncomfortably. And Tyler, he froze. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. He tried to laugh, to charm his way out, but the proof was overwhelming, factual, undeniable. There were no arguments, no subjective interpretations, no polite dismissals, just clear evidence of entitlement and manipulation. I passed around the documents calmly, as if offering everyone a glimpse into history, and let the truth speak. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Tyler's bravado melted in real time. My parents, forced to confront the undeniable facts, had no choice but to acknowledge it. The expressions of shock, disbelief, and subtle shame were almost artistic in their clarity. I stayed composed, smiling faintly, my calm presence in sharp contrast to Tyler's unraveling. Every piece of evidence I had collected, every strategic observation, every moment of patience had built to this instant, and it was flawless. Then I took it a step further. I revealed small, corroborated moments of favoritism and hypocrisy from my parents. Nothing cruel, nothing personal, just facts. They had always celebrated Tyler while dismissing me, and now, faced with objective records, their justification faltered. My mother's smile wavered, my father's casual shrug became stiff, and Tyler's hands fidgeted nervously. The hierarchy they had constructed over decades, the one that had dictated my life, crumbled like dry leaves under a sudden wind. The reactions were subtle at first, but cumulative. My cousins whispered among themselves, surprised at the audacity and thoroughness of my preparation. Some nodded at me, clearly impressed. Tyler's ego, which had been untouchable, finally cracked under the weight of exposure and undeniable proof. I watched him struggle, his usual charm failing completely, every excuse he tried to offer falling flat. The confidence he had relied on for years was gone, replaced by vulnerability, uncertainty, and the first genuine fear I had ever seen in him. And then came the final flourish. I had prepared a small, symbolic gesture that would drive the point home. A dessert plate in front of me, elegantly arranged, a modest indulgence that mirrored what Tyler had once claimed as VIP only. I picked it up, smiled at the table, and said softly, I think I'll enjoy my celebration now. The combination of calm confidence, undeniable success, and subtle poetic justice struck everyone. Tyler's mouth opened, closed, and finally, he slumped back in his chair, speechless. My parents exchanged looks, and the room collectively understood that something monumental had shifted. The aftermath was silent, yet explosive. Tyler avoided eye contact for the rest of the evening. My parents didn't scold me, didn't chastise me. They couldn't. The hierarchy was gone, the narrative rewritten, and the weight of truth had landed squarely on the side of justice. Even my cousins, the casual witnesses to decades of manipulation, seemed to view me differently now. They nodded subtly, offered small smiles, and treated me with an unspoken respect that had never been extended before. I left that night quietly, not gloating, not performing for anyone, just walking away with the deep, satisfying knowledge that the game had been won. Tyler would recover, of course. His ego would mend. But the pedestal he had relied on for decades had been shattered in one calm, deliberate evening. My parents would think twice before underestimating me again. And I, for the first time in my life, had proven not to them, but to myself, that I was more than the sum of their judgments. Months later, the ripple effects were still unfolding. Tyler's credibility, previously assumed invincible within the family, was subtly diminished. My parents adjusted their expectations, treating me with quiet deference they had never offered before. I continued to grow my business, expand my network, and build a life defined not by others' approval, but by my own choices. And every once in a while, when I thought back to that night, I smiled, not with arrogance, but with the deep, unshakable satisfaction of someone who had endured, planned, and finally reclaimed their life. The beauty of it all was that the revenge had been executed not with fury, but with intelligence, patience, and composure. Every humiliation, every betrayal, every slight that had once been a wound became a stepping stone. Tyler had fallen, my parents had faltered, and I had risen, not in anger, not in spectacle, but in quiet, undeniable strength. And as I sat back in the quiet of my apartment that night, reflecting on the journey, I realized the truth. No chair, no dessert, no entitlement could define me anymore. The celebration, the real celebration, had finally begun. It was mine, entirely and unconditionally, and no one could ever take it away. Hi Reddit, I'm Travis, 34, and I never thought I'd be the kind of person to have this much anger boiling inside about something as supposedly simple as a birthday party. But here I am, sitting on my couch at 11 p.m., replaying the events of today like a nightmare I can't wake up from. And honestly, I need to get this off my chest, because if I tell it to anyone else in my family, they'll probably twist it around so I look like the bad guy. So, here's what happened. And trust me, it's worse than it sounds. It started with my niece's birthday. My daughter, Ellie, who's 6, has always had a soft spot for her cousin, Jake, my brother's son, even though their personalities couldn't be more different. Ellie is quiet, thoughtful, and creative, always crafting little gifts or drawing pictures for people she loves. Jake, on the other hand, is what you'd call a handful. My brother, Mark, likes to say he's spirited and full of energy, but in reality, he's just poorly behaved, and Mark rarely disciplines him. I don't know if it's laziness or if Mark honestly thinks spoiling him is parenting. Either way, it's a disaster waiting to happen. So, I got the invite for Jake's birthday party a week in advance. I debated whether I even wanted to go. Mark and I have a tense history. We've always had a kind of competitive, passive-aggressive thing going on, the kind where every conversation feels like a minefield. Growing up, Mark was the favorite, louder, more charming, naturally commanding attention, while I was quieter, more introverted, and always trying to avoid the spotlight. Our parents definitely fueled it, intentionally or not, and somehow that dynamic never really faded. Even now, as adults, Mark has this way of making any interaction feel like a contest he's winning. Despite that, I decided to take Ellie. I thought, maybe today isn't about Mark, maybe it's about my daughter and her cousin. So I wrapped a gift for Jake, a hand-painted Lego display stand that I spent hours putting together with Ellie. I knew it was perfect because Ellie had painstakingly painted it herself, every little detail, chosen to match Jake's favorite Star Wars characters. It wasn't cheap or extravagant, but it was thoughtful, and I thought that would matter more. We arrived at Mark's house around 2 in the afternoon. The backyard was a colorful mess of balloons, streamers, and kiddie tables, exactly what you'd expect from a 6-year-old's birthday. Mark was standing by the grill, flipping burgers, wearing this wide grin like the king of the universe. His wife, Lisa, was bustling around making sure everything ran smoothly, or at least her version of smooth. I waved and got a half-hearted nod from Mark. That should have been my first warning, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself that's just Mark being Mark. For the first 30 minutes, things were fine. Kids were running around. The cake hadn't been cut yet, and Ellie was cautiously exploring the chaos, hugging her cousins and showing them her drawings. And then it happened. Jake, without warning, grabbed Ellie's gift off the table while she was distracted with another kid, tore open the wrapping paper, and started smashing it on the ground. I froze. My stomach dropped. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, not because of the broken gift itself, but because of the look on Ellie's face. Her eyes went wide, mouth trembling, trying not to cry in front of all the other kids. And that's when Mark saw it. Instead of apologizing or even attempting to calm his son, Mark exploded. I mean, full-on, yelling, pointing, red-faced, the kind of reaction you only see in those over-the-top reality shows. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked. His voice echoed across the yard, making heads turn. "Leave now. Your family isn't welcome here." I'm not exaggerating when I say my jaw literally dropped. I stood there, stunned, trying to process whether he was serious. Was he actually kicking us out because his son ruined a gift? Because he himself hadn't taught his kid how to behave? My mind raced. I felt this mix of anger, disbelief, and sadness all at once. I could feel Ellie clutching my leg, trembling, and I swallowed hard to keep my voice steady. "Sure," I said calmly, nodding. "No problem. We'll go." For a moment, Mark probably thought that would be it, that I'd slink out like the polite, quiet sibling I've always been. But here's the thing. He doesn't know me very well. He's never really understood that I'm not the type to back down quietly when someone crosses the line with my family, especially my daughter. So as we started to walk out, I said something that made him pause, even if he didn't realize it immediately. "Actually," I added casually, "I'll bring some friends too." The words barely registered in his mind. I could see the confusion flicker across his face. Friends? Who was I talking about? Mark opened his mouth, probably to yell again, but I just gave him a small, polite smile and kept walking toward the car. Ellie, sensing my calm, straightened up and held her head high. I glanced at her and whispered, "Don't worry, kiddo. We've got this." What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, is that I had spent the last few weeks quietly inviting a few people over, friends of mine who also happen to know Mark's house, know him personally, and have a vested interest in seeing him squirm a little. It wasn't a huge crowd, just enough to make a statement. I hadn't planned it as revenge exactly, more like a controlled demonstration of the consequences of his behavior. And in my mind, it was going to be perfect because it wasn't chaotic, it wasn't loud. It was calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. As we loaded the car, I could feel Mark's eyes on me, scanning, probably trying to guess what I meant. I caught a glimpse of Lisa in the doorway, her face frozen in that expression of disbelief that comes when someone completely shatters your expectations of how a situation should go. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, wondering if she should intervene, if she should stop me, if she should call me out right then and there. She didn't. She didn't say anything at all. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about a birthday gift or even a tantrum. This was about power, respect, and finally refusing to accept Mark's toxic behavior as the norm. All those years of being dismissed, of watching my ideas and efforts get ignored while he got the spotlight, it had built up quietly inside me. And now, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I glanced at Ellie in the back seat, clutching her little stuffed animal, trying to make sense of what just happened. I whispered again, "Don't worry. We're going to show him what happens when you mess with our family." She gave a small nod, eyes wide but curious, trusting me completely. That trust, more than anything, lit a fire under me. I wasn't just doing this for me. I was doing it for her. As we drove down the street, I felt this mix of exhilaration and dread. Exhilaration because for once, I had a plan that didn't rely on arguing or yelling or trying to reason with someone completely unreasonable. Dread because I knew Mark would react, and he always escalates when he feels challenged. I didn't know exactly how he would respond, but I knew it wouldn't be small or subtle. Pulling into the driveway of my house, I began to organize quietly. Friends would be arriving soon, and I had already set the stage perfectly. Every detail mattered: the timing, the positioning, the optics. I wanted him to realize that this wasn't a chaotic outburst. This wasn't a lucky coincidence. This was intentional, calm, measured, and very, very pointed. And as I watched Ellie run ahead to grab her coloring supplies, I felt a strange sense of calm. Today had started with humiliation and anger, but it was about to end with clarity, and maybe a little justice, too. So, here's where things started to spiral even further. After we got home from Mark's house, I didn't rush to act. That's not my style. I needed time to think, to make sure every move I made was deliberate. But the thing is, the aftermath of what happened at the party didn't fade away quietly. It lingered, gnawed at me. Ellie couldn't stop talking about her ruined gift. Every time she tried to mention it, her eyes welled up. I hated seeing her like that. She was normally so resilient, but she felt genuinely betrayed by her cousin, by her uncle, by the fact that the adults in the situation seemed completely indifferent. I knew I couldn't let it go, not just because of the gift, but because of the pattern it represented. Mark's household had always been this way. Favoritism disguised as parenting. Jake could do whatever he wanted, and everyone laughed it off. If I raised an eyebrow, if I tried to correct him, I was overreacting or being too uptight. And it wasn't just Mark. Lisa had been complicit for years. She would scold me for being dramatic while letting Jake get away with literal destruction. Every time I've spoken up, I've been met with condescending smiles, rolling eyes, and a subtle but unmistakable sense that my feelings didn't matter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene. Ellie's tiny hands trying to protect her gift, Jake laughing as he ripped it apart, Mark's face turning red with rage as he yelled at us to leave. I imagined what would happen if I didn't let it slide this time. I imagined making him feel a fraction of the helplessness and embarrassment he had made my daughter feel. And that thought didn't frighten me. It energized me. Over the next few days, I started to notice other things, small patterns of favoritism that I hadn't fully registered before. Mark would give Jake every new gadget or toy he wanted immediately, while Jake's older cousin, my niece, Emma, would get told to wait or was given something clearly secondhand. At family dinners, Mark would talk over me, Lisa would dismiss my opinions, and Jake would constantly interrupt Ellie, always getting what he wanted. And the worst part? Everyone else seemed fine with it. They'd laugh at Jake's antics, whisper to each other about how spirited he was, while I was left glaring quietly, wishing someone would acknowledge how toxic it all felt. It all came to a head during the week leading up to the next family gathering. Mark invited us over for a pre-celebration barbecue for Jake's kindergarten graduation. I didn't want to go. I wanted to protect Ellie, to shield her from further disappointment. But Ellie insisted, her eyes pleading, her small voice saying, "Please, Dad, I just want to see everyone." And I couldn't say no, not without crushing her. So we went, cautiously, tension buzzing between us like electricity. From the moment we arrived, the dynamics were exactly what I feared. Jake was running wild, climbing furniture, knocking over drinks. Mark and Lisa laughed, clapped him on the back, and encouraged his chaos. Ellie tried to play quietly with some coloring books, sitting off to the side, but every time she started to relax, Jake would swoop in, grabbing her crayons or scribbling over her drawings. Each time it happened, my patience frayed a little more. Finally, after the third incident, I calmly told Jake, "Please don't do that, it's not nice." Mark's reaction was immediate. He barked at me like I'd just accused him of theft. "What are you doing, Travis? Stop trying to control him. He's a kid. He's having fun." I swallowed hard. "I'm not trying to control him. I just want him to respect my daughter's things." "Your daughter's things? Come on. She's fine. He's fine. Stop making a scene," Mark snapped. Lisa chimed in, smiling too brightly, the kind of fake sweetness that always made my skin crawl. "Travis, you worry too much. Kids will be kids. Just let it go." I glanced at Ellie, who was clutching a torn sheet of paper she'd been coloring on. Her face was pale, and she didn't even want to look at me. She had learned, at 6 years old, to retreat silently when she felt powerless. And that, seeing her shrink under the weight of their favoritism, hit me harder than anything. I stayed calm externally, but inside, my thoughts were racing. I couldn't believe I had tolerated this for so long. I couldn't believe my own family could be so dismissive, so blatantly biased, so unwilling to acknowledge when they hurt someone I loved. I felt my hands tighten into fists, and I promised myself something in that moment. No more. Not this time. And then it happened. The moment that changed everything. The thing that shattered any remaining illusion of normalcy or fairness. Mark, in one of his increasingly erratic attempts to assert dominance over the situation, decided to show everyone how important Jake's achievements were. He started bragging, loudly, about how Jake was going to be a star and better than any kid in the class. and then he turned his gaze to Ellie. "And Travis," he said, leaning on the railing with that smug grin. "You really should teach your daughter to keep up. She might want to try harder if she doesn't want to be left behind." The words were like ice water down my spine. I froze for a second, stunned, before Ellie's eyes filled with tears. She looked up at me, ashamed, confused, hurt, like it was her fault somehow. I felt my chest tighten, my stomach twist. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake Mark. I wanted to pick Ellie up and leave forever. But I held my composure, because this was bigger than a reaction. This was the tipping point. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, it did. Jake, my brother's son, threw Ellie's backpack across the yard, scattering her drawings, crayons, and favorite little notebooks. I didn't move at first, because I couldn't believe my eyes. It was deliberate, aggressive, and cruel. Mark laughed. Lisa laughed. Every adult there laughed. And Ellie, the little girl who had always tried to stay quiet, buried her face in my shoulder and whispered, "Why do they hate me?" That's when I realized this wasn't just favoritism. This wasn't just ignorance. This was a betrayal, an active choice to make Ellie feel small, unworthy, and dismissed. And it wasn't going to stop unless I made it stop. My anger was boiling, but I knew that if I reacted immediately, it would play into Mark's hands. He thrives on drama, on the ability to manipulate situations and make others look unreasonable. So I took a deep breath, steadied my voice, and said something that made him blink, just slightly, out of pure confusion. "You know what, Mark? Sure, Ellie might not be like Jake, but that doesn't mean she deserves this. She deserves better. And I won't let you or anyone else make her feel less than." The yard went quiet. Well, almost quiet. Lisa whispered something to a friend nearby, probably hoping to downplay my words. But for the first time, I felt a shift in the air. Something had changed. I could see the confusion, maybe even a flicker of fear, in Mark's eyes. He hadn't expected me to stand my ground like that. And that's when I knew everything had led to this moment. The tipping point had arrived. Ellie clung to my side, still trembling, and I whispered, "Don't worry. Daddy's got you." And even though I was calm, inside I felt a storm building. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same between us and Mark's family after today. This was bigger than a gift, bigger than a party. This was about standing up for my daughter and finally, refusing to accept their toxic favoritism and disregard for her feelings. And in that moment, as I looked around the yard, watching the stunned faces of the adults who had always gotten away with dismissing me and my family, I knew the next step would be pivotal. The friends I had quietly recruited, they hadn't arrived yet. The plan I had spent weeks refining, it was ready to unfold. And when it did, Mark wouldn't just be embarrassed. He'd be confronted with the consequences of years of entitlement, favoritism, and cruelty. The problem was, even as I felt a surge of determination, I couldn't shake the dread. What if it spiraled out of control? What if they didn't see the point, didn't understand the message? But deep down, I knew this had to happen. Ellie deserved that much. And for the first time, I wasn't just thinking about what Mark had done to me growing up. I was thinking about what he had done to my family now, and I was done letting it slide. So I stood there, holding Ellie close, and waited. The days after that barbecue were some of the worst I've had in years. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head, the laughter at Ellie's expense, the way Mark had turned it into a performance, the way Lisa had quietly signaled approval. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut repeatedly, and no matter what I did, the feeling lingered. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that it was just a party, just kids being kids, just family dynamics as usual. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This was about respect. This was about boundaries. And I had spent my life letting them get trampled. For a few days, I actually considered stepping back entirely. I thought about limiting contact with Mark, Lisa, and even extended family. I thought about isolating myself and Ellie from the toxicity entirely. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something crucial. Retreating wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't teach Mark that his behavior had consequences, and it wouldn't protect Ellie from learning that the world doesn't always reward kindness or patience. I had to find a way to rise above it, not just for myself, but for her. So I started small. I made a list of everything I could control: Ellie's environment, our home, her experiences, the people she interacted with, and the lessons I wanted to instill in her. I realized that my focus had always been on trying to change Mark and his household, and that was a losing battle. They were never going to see reason unless there was a cost. What I could do, however, was make sure Ellie never felt powerless again. That became my mission. I began taking her on little adventures every weekend. Museums, local theaters, even just long walks in the park where we could talk without distractions. I wanted her to see that kindness and creativity were valuable, and that her feelings mattered. And as I watched her light up when she painted or built Lego sets, or when she proudly showed me a new drawing, I started to feel a little of the weight lift off my shoulders. I was doing something right. She was thriving despite the chaos from the other side of our family, and that gave me strength. At the same time, I quietly started thinking about the bigger picture. The friends I had hinted at during the last party, they weren't just friends. They were people I trusted implicitly, people who understood Mark's manipulations because they'd either experienced them or witnessed them firsthand. Some were colleagues, some old friends from college, and one even had a bit of a reputation for making things awkward in very public ways, but nothing malicious. I had started reaching out to them discreetly, explaining what had happened with Ellie and Jake and the pattern of toxic behavior from Mark and Lisa. They were immediately on board. What surprised me most wasn't their willingness to help. It was the subtle ways they contributed ideas I hadn't thought of. One suggested we document things quietly, not for evidence in any legal sense, but so that when Mark inevitably tried to deny or gaslight, there would be a clear, undeniable record. Another suggested a strategy of calm, public exposure rather than confrontation, letting Mark's arrogance and entitlement be seen without me having to raise my voice. I threw myself into these plans with a quiet obsession. I spent hours thinking about logistics, timing, and optics. It wasn't about revenge in the sense of getting him back. It was about reclaiming my dignity and teaching Ellie that standing up for yourself doesn't have to mean losing your cool. It's about strategy, preparation, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the moral high ground is yours. Meanwhile, I also started noticing a shift in myself. The frustration and anger, which had felt suffocating, started to become something productive. I realized that I had spent so much of my life trying to please my family, trying to navigate their expectations, trying to avoid conflict, that I had lost touch with what I wanted and valued. I was working a decent job, making enough to get by, but I had never really built anything for myself. That needed to change. I picked up projects I had abandoned years ago. I started a small freelance side business doing graphic design work I had loved in college, something I had shelved because family obligations and realistic priorities had always come first. I devoted weekends and evenings to it, and slowly, I began to see results, not just monetary, but confidence-wise. Clients started referring others. My work was being noticed. More importantly, I felt like I was building a world in which I had control, rather than always reacting to Mark or Lisa's whims. Ellie noticed too. She would watch me sketch, type, or plan business strategies, and sometimes she'd ask questions or make small suggestions. And each time she did, I felt this incredible sense of pride, not because she agreed with me, but because she was learning that it was okay to have ideas, to take initiative, and to be valued for them. Watching her grow and gain confidence was healing in a way I hadn't anticipated. The turning point, though, came during a casual family gathering I didn't even plan. Mark, of course, tried to start the usual game of comparison, subtly belittling Ellie while praising Jake. "Ellie's really cute, Travis, but maybe she needs a little more practice on that," he said in that condescending tone he reserves for anyone he perceives as lesser. Ellie, for a moment, looked like she might shrink away again. But this time, something had shifted. I held her hand, leaned down, and said softly, "Ignore him. You're amazing exactly the way you are." And then I did something I hadn't done before. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't beg for him to see reason. I simply smiled, walked over to where Jake was bouncing on the couch, and quietly redirected the conversation. I started telling a story about a recent project Ellie had done for school, highlighting her creativity and effort, and for the first time, I noticed something. People were listening. Not just politely, they were genuinely engaged. Mark looked around, confused, trying to gauge whether he had lost control of the narrative. Lisa subtly rolled her eyes, probably realizing that her usual tactics of distraction and praise for Jake weren't working anymore. I could feel a quiet sense of satisfaction, but I didn't let it show too much. This was still about rebuilding, about teaching Ellie that strength doesn't always roar. It can be quiet, deliberate, and persistent. In the weeks that followed, I continued building this quiet momentum. Ellie was more confident. I was more confident. I started branching out further with my freelance work, even considering some bigger opportunities one had previously thought were out of reach. And while Mark continued to be irritating, dismissive, and at times outright cruel, his influence over me and Ellie started to wane. I realized that reclaiming my own life, my own self-worth, and my daughter's confidence was the only way to truly counteract years of toxic behavior. By the time the next big family gathering rolled around, a summer barbecue that Mark had intended as another opportunity to showcase Jake, I felt ready. Not to confront him directly, not to yell or fight, but to demonstrate, subtly and unavoidably, that years of entitlement and favoritism had consequences. I had allies now, quiet but significant, and Ellie and I were stronger than we had been at the first party. I could feel it in my chest, a mix of anticipation, nervousness, and determination. I had learned something crucial during this fall and rise period. True power isn't about shouting the loudest or demanding attention. It's about preparation, strategy, and teaching those who follow you that their worth doesn't depend on the whims of the entitled. And while Mark might never understand that, the next time he tried to diminish Ellie or me, he was going to learn something he couldn't ignore. So, as I packed up a few things for the upcoming gathering, arranging timing, positioning, and who would say what, I felt a calm resolve I hadn't experienced before. Ellie sat beside me, excited but unaware of the full plan, and I told her, "We're going to have fun, and we're going to show everyone exactly how incredible you are." She smiled, her face bright, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the world might actually bend a little in our favor. By the time I started planning the setup, the anger that had eaten at me for weeks had settled into a colder, quieter thing. Less a roar and more the steady hum of a machine waiting to be turned on. I had learned from the fall and the rise that rage is only useful when it's disciplined. So I disciplined mine. I made lists, because I have always been a list person. I mapped out timing, and I leaned on the few people I could trust to keep their mouths shut and their actions precise. This wasn't going to be a scene. It was going to be an unraveling done deliberately, with care, with optics that would make it impossible for Mark to gaslight his way out of it. Recruiting allies was easier than I expected, not because people love drama, but because people hate being watchful bystanders when they've seen cruelty cleanly dismissed. Sam, who I'd worked with at the design studio for years, volunteered immediately after I told him about the backpack incident. He'd seen Mark's attitude at family events before and had helped me in small ways, texting me when a particularly nasty comment was made or offering a calm presence when I felt my temper spike. Priya, a neighbor and one of Ellie's favorite art teachers, offered to bring over some of her former students, all preteens/teenagers, who owed her favors. She wanted to show my daughter that a circle of people could be supportive in ways Mark would never understand. Marcus, an old friend from college who could be awkward and blunt, but had a knack for making people feel uncomfortable in public without being overtly cruel, agreed to come too. I asked Jenna, an older cousin who had quietly distanced herself from Mark's family years ago, but who still attended holidays out of obligation, to be present as well. She'd always been the kind of person who notices details and remembers them. I was careful about who I told what. This had to be surgical. No public tattling. No humiliation that crossed into cruelty. I wanted to expose, not destroy. I wanted to show Ellie that adults could act with dignity and strength, and that the people who chose to belittle others would have to face the consequences of their choices. I also wanted to make sure the people who mattered, extended family who might side with Mark out of habit, saw the truth without me having to escalate into a screaming match that would only let Mark play the victim card. The plan itself had layers. The first layer was simply presence. People who would notice, remember, and later corroborate when needed. If Mark tried to paint me as the aggressor, again, I wanted him to be contradicted by more than one voice. The second layer was documentation. Sam is meticulous with his phone camera, and offered to unobtrusively record snippets, short clips, not one long gotcha video, but enough to show context if it ever became necessary. Priya would bring her students under the guise of wanting to organize a small art activity for the kids, innocuous, helpful, and a way to give Ellie visible allies. Marcus would be intentionally awkward in conversation with Mark. He's the kind of person who asks the exact wrong question at the worst moment, and that would throw Mark off balance. Jenna agreed to quietly pull aside anyone who might be on the fence and plant the seed that Mark's behavior had been a pattern for years. Each element had a purpose. I won't pretend I wasn't nervous. This was family, after all. People I had shared birthdays and illnesses and holidays with. People who had seen me at my worst and my best. But the difference now was that I wasn't trying to keep the peace at the cost of my daughter's dignity. More than anything, I imagined Ellie years from now, remembering this as the day we chose to stand up. That image steadied me. I began arranging who would sit where at the barbecue Mark had planned. The event he'd named Family Sunday, when he wanted people to admire how perfect his household appeared. I timed arrivals so that friends would trickle in as if by coincidence, then cluster in the spots where conversations would matter, by the grill, near the kids' tables, and on the sun-dappled patch of lawn where the adults liked to stand and talk. Optics matter. People see what they expect to see until you change what they expect. I also rehearsed what I would say, because when the moment came, I wanted to be measured. I pictured myself using the quiet voice I had cultivated over the past months, the one that doesn't explode but commands attention because it's steady. I imagined saying, "We're here to celebrate Jake, but let's also make sure the kids are being respectful." Nothing accusatory, nothing theatrical, just an insistence on basic decency. Mark's likely response was easy to predict. Irritation, mockery, then an attempt to regain control by turning people's attention to some boast or story about Jake. But what happens when the attention of the adults is already focused elsewhere, when multiple people are watching, and when a few unexpected voices politely but firmly insist on standards? That's what I had learned to cultivate, the chorus of common sense. The more concrete parts of the plan were logistical. I booked the arts and crafts kit Priya wanted to bring so that Ellie would have something to do that was obviously hers. I made sure there were a few extra chairs near where Jenna and I would sit, so we could stage a casual conversation that would reveal a pattern without sounding like an attack. Marcus would arrive early and pretend to be irritated at the parking situation so he could strike up a conversation with Mark that would highlight his lack of patience. Sam agreed to bring his camera disguised as a picnic cooler. It sounds absurd now when I say it out loud, but planning details is how you keep drama from becoming chaos. In the week leading up to the barbecue, I also made smaller, human choices that felt important. I bought Ellie a new sketchbook and some watercolors, not because she needed them, but because I wanted her to feel treasured in a way that a ripped backpack couldn't erase. I spent time building her confidence in simple ways, letting her pick the music in the car, praising her for the smallest creative choices, asking her to help me with plans in a way that made her feel involved. These things mattered. Revenge without restoration is just cruelty. My aim was to show her that kindness is powerful and that standing up for someone can be done with integrity. On the morning of the event, I woke earlier than planned. There was a clarity in the air that comes before something important, part fear, part focus, and part the odd thrill of finally seeing plans through. Ellie was quiet in the kitchen, humming as she packed a small bag of crayons and that new sketchbook. She looked up as I entered and grinned, the kind of pure, unself-conscious smile that had kept me going through sleepless nights. "Dad, do you think Jake will behave?" she asked. I knelt and took her face in my hands. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But no matter what, I'll be with you." The drive to Mark's house felt like a march. I felt the familiar twinge, part guilt, part resolve, that always comes when you choose to confront rather than avoid. I told myself that guilt had been a prison for too long, a way of keeping my mouth shut at the cost of letting other people's cruelty slide. Today that would end. We pulled up and I saw Mark in the driveway, setting up lawn games, resplendent in his usual confident posture. He looked at me, registered my presence, and gave a short, automatic nod. For a second I thought he would say something snide, but he didn't. Maybe he assumed we'd quietly take our place and be a minor non-event. That was always his assumption, that people would acquiesce when he claimed the narrative. He hadn't yet learned that the narrative could be reclaimed. As we stepped out of the car, Sam and Marcus arrived, as if by chance. Sam's cooler hummed suspiciously like a camera. Marcus pretended to be annoyed about lawn chairs, only to circle back and stand near where Mark was prepping the grill. Priya arrived not long after, with 4 of her older students trailing behind. Clever, artful kids who had been primed to engage with Ellie and make her feel seen. Jenna slid in quietly and took her usual place near the patio table, giving me a look that said she was ready. The placements were subtle but effective. People who would speak up if necessary were in places where they could be heard without creating a spectacle. It felt almost theatrical how seamless the arrivals were. That was part of why it worked. People never suspect what happens when nothing appears forced. The party began with the usual choreography. Small talk that barely schemes beneath the surface, made more awkward by the knowledge I carried like weight in my pocket. Kids scattered to the bounce house. Parents clustered into groups. And Mark started his routine, showing off a new grill accessory, loudly praising his son's energy, trying to set the tone of a flawless family afternoon. He even tossed a compliment in my direction, the kind of patronizing quip that tries to re-establish dominance. "Good to see you, Travis. Thanks for bringing Ellie." He said it like a man who believes he has done me a favor by allowing me into his social arena. I smiled and nodded, letting it slide. That was another part of the plan. Don't give him the reaction he wants. Let his small power plays reveal themselves for what they are, gestures without substance. Instead, I walked Ellie over to the arts and crafts table where Priya and her students were setting up colorful stations. A few kids gathered around. Some were cousins, some were neighbors, and a few, delightfully, were kids Mark didn't know well. That was important. It meant the judgment wouldn't come from a circle of devotees but from a broader, more neutral audience. Early on, the mood was deceptively calm. Mark laughed too loudly at a joke, offered pointless advice to another uncle, and chewed loudly on the kind of superiority that had always been his hallmark. He made a few small barbs. Ellie will probably draw something cute, and the adults around him either chuckled or pretended not to hear. I listened, nodded when necessary, and kept my focus on Ellie's small, concentrated joy as she painted. She looked up at me occasionally, delighted by color and paper, and each look felt like a small reclaiming of the territory he'd tried to claim. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that things started to shift in ways I had hoped for. Marcus, in his charmingly awkward way, asked Mark about the time he'd mentioned a scholarship Jake was already lining up for. Mark puffed up, as he always did, ready to spin another yarn about his child's inevitable greatness. But instead of letting the room accept the boast, Marcus asked the question differently, direct and oddly specific. "So, Mark, which classes has Jake actually finished? Which activities did he follow through on?" Because my nephew also had a coach who was very proud of him until he stopped showing up halfway through the season. The question landed like a pebble in still water. Mark's initial response was a dismissive chuckle, but the chuckle didn't have the absolute assurance it usually did. For the first time, his posture twitched. He began to answer, and then hesitated, searching for ground that would justify his claim. That fraction of uncertainty was all it took. Sam, cool, quiet Sam, leaned in with a casual story about a time Mark had loudly promised a school donation he'd never followed through on, not to embarrass him, but to point out how words and actions don't always match. Priya's students began to chime in, praising Ellie's watercolors in a way that made the circle near the patio pay attention. People noticed the difference between actual contribution and performative boasting, and the attention started to shift. Mark noticed, too. I could see it on his face, the micro-cascades of panic that ripple through someone used to being the center of a comfortable orbit. He tried to regain composure with jokes about tough critics, and asked loudly if anyone wanted more burgers, trying to steer everything back to neutral territory. But the atmosphere had tilted. The adults who had once laughed at Jake's antics now exchanged glances. A few eyebrows rose. It was subtle, but a tilt is a tilt, and tilts become landslides when enough small shifts accumulate. Ellie, sensing the change, colored with renewed vigor. She was surrounded, not by a dismissive chorus, but by kids and a few adults who genuinely admired what she was making. I caught Jenna's eye and she mouthed, "Hold." Her expression was calm, but fierce in a way I had come to trust. That's what I wanted. Calm, fierce, coordinated. Just as I thought the tilt might be enough, Mark did something I hadn't predicted but which fit his pattern perfectly. He decided to reclaim the stage, not with subtlety, but with an overcorrection that only revealed his insecurity. He rose, raised his voice, and declared that he had an announcement about something important regarding Jake. People shuffled closer, curiosity piqued. I felt my chest constrict because I knew this move. It was his classic pivot to spectacle when he sensed slipping control. He loved spectacle, and this would be the moment he tried to turn it into a display of his generosity and Jake's achievement. My mouth went dry. This was where preparation mattered. If he turned the spotlight his way with a claim that painted him in a benevolent light, the tide could ebb back in his favor if I reacted poorly. But if we let him have his moment in public and then calmly introduced a series of facts and observations, quiet, polite, undeniable, the unraveling would continue. That's precisely when Sam nudged me, just the lightest touch, and mouthed, "Now." Priya shifted so her students could present a small piece from Ellie's table. Marcus, with a look that suggested he was about to ask the wrong question in precisely the right way, moved into position. Mark cleared his throat and smiled the wide, practiced smile of a man about to be adored. The yard fell into that peculiar hush that happens when people expect entertainment. I breathed slowly, feeling every muscle tense in anticipation. Ellie looked up, curious, from her painting, and I put a finger gently to my lips, signaling her that everything was going according to plan. Mark began to speak, and for a brief second, I wondered if he might actually say something sane, something about the kids, about community. Then his voice rose into the familiar crescendo of self-promotion, and I felt the moment we had been pushing toward crystallize into a live scene. That's when Jenna stood, casually, and said, in a voice that carried without stridency, "Oh, Mark, before you announce, could you remind everyone about that time you promised the school a fundraiser? I don't remember seeing it happen." The tone was conversational, but the implication sat like a stone. Mark's smile faltered. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked around. I watched his face, the flush creeping up his neck, the smallest of tremors in his hands. For the first time in years, he looked unsure in front of people who mattered. He took a breath, and the backyard seemed to hold its breath with him. That was the precise second when someone else, one of Priya's students, a quiet kid with freckles, stood up and presented Ellie's watercolor, explaining how she'd helped her with the technique. Another parent nodded, then another, and the momentum shifted so subtly it was almost invisible. Mark's planned spectacle was dissolving into a series of small truths delivered with ordinary voices. And the truth, once it gains even a sliver of space, tends to spread. Mark's eyes landed on me. For a second, there was a flicker. Anger, yes, but also the unmistakable fear of a man sensing that his authority is slipping. He started to move toward the patio, probably intending to reclaim control with a joke, a forced laugh, or a cutting remark. I felt my pulse thrum in my ears. This was the hinge. If he slammed down the door in a way that threatened humiliation, the fallout could be messy. If he tried a petty retaliation, it would be public and likely self-defeating. Either way, the next few breaths would determine whether the setup had worked. I glanced at Ellie. She was holding her painting, cheeks flushed with the innocent thrill of being seen. She didn't understand the theater of adult power, but she felt the warmth of people valuing her. I felt something like a tide begin to swell in my chest. Relief, yes, but also that old, familiar edge of worry because Mark was still unpredictable. He took a step forward, jaw set. The backyard fell into that poignant pause that happens before fireworks. Everyone is waiting for the first spark. I could feel Sam's hand brush mine. He was steady. Marcus shifted his weight, as if preparing to interject. Priya's students clustered protectively around Ellie. Jenna adjusted her chair so she could block an attempted approach. And then Mark opened his mouth. What he said next would either blow the whole thing apart or cement the truth in a way that he could not easily refute. He began, and the sound of his voice cut through the hush, an attempt to laugh it off, to reassert himself. But the words that followed were not the powerful, confident declarations he'd hoped for. They were thin, brittle, and revealed more than he intended. The garden of carefully planted doubt I'd seeded over months was about to bloom in a public, unmistakable way. And then, as he spoke, the first of the small pieces we'd arranged to topple his narrative came together. And the sound of it was not a shout, but a dozen small, everyday voices telling one simple truth. I felt time slow, the moment stretching into something enormous. The moment everything came together was almost imperceptible at first, but once it started, there was no stopping it. Mark had begun his usual self-aggrandizing spiel, expecting smiles and admiration, and instead, the air had shifted. I could feel it in the tension, in the way the other adults in the yard were watching, some shifting awkwardly, some leaning incuriously, all sensing that this particular performance was unraveling. I had learned to wait for these small moments, to let the stage set itself. The setup had been meticulous, but now it needed execution, and timing was everything. Mark launched into his proud recounting of Jake's accomplishments, with a voice that rang too loud and too sharp. "Everyone should know," he started, as though making a proclamation, "that Jake has been accepted into," and then paused, scanning faces, expecting laughter, nods, or gasps of admiration. That was when Jenna casually interrupted, with the lightest of smiles, as though she were merely curious. "Mark, I just wanted to ask, didn't you promise the PDA a donation last spring? The one for the new library section?" For a fraction of a second, Mark blinked. Then his smile faltered, twitching just slightly at the corners, the practiced mask cracking. The laughter he had expected didn't come. I noticed it first in the younger parents, the ones who weren't invested in Jake's supposed greatness. There was curiosity, almost concern. "Yes, well, it was delayed. We had some scheduling." He tried to dismiss it quickly, but that hesitation was the hinge I had been waiting for. "And the fundraiser for the sports team last fall, did that happen too?" Marcus asked next, tilting his head in that way he always did. The way that makes someone feel like their story is falling apart under gentle scrutiny. Mark swallowed. He opened his mouth to answer, but then stopped. I could see the shift across his face, the panic creeping in. He tried a joke, a deflection, something about how things get busy, but by now the crowd had picked up on the pattern. Small, seemingly inconsequential things stacked together, painting a picture of promises made and not kept, a trail of arrogance and empty gestures. Sam stepped up quietly, pretending to rearrange the cooler but speaking in a low, calm tone that carried just enough for the surrounding adults to hear. "I remember when you told the 5th grade class they'd have a full art supply set if they met their reading goals. Some of us even checked in later. They never got it. You were proud of promising it, weren't you?" Mark's eyes darted around the yard. There was a pause, that slow, uncomfortable pause where the adult trying to maintain control realizes he is none. Some people shifted on their feet, murmured to each other, and looked at Mark in a way they hadn't before. Less admiration, more questioning. Then Priya's students began showing off Ellie's work. They explained the techniques she had learned and practiced, highlighted her patience and attention to detail, and praised her creativity in ways that didn't feel forced. One of the older kids said plainly, "Ellie didn't just follow instructions, she led the project." Simple words, but they landed like bricks. Adults around the table nodded, impressed, noticing that she had accomplished something substantial while Mark's star child had been running in circles, knocking over drinks and breaking crayons. Ellie, completely unaware of the full strategy, beamed. She stood taller, proud, clutching her watercolors as if they were a shield and a banner at the same time. I felt a swell of emotion, the kind that makes your chest ache because it's relief and pride and anticipation all at once. This was the fruit of months of patience, careful planning, and emotional resilience. Mark realized the tide had turned. His attempts to interject, to boast, to charm his way back into authority fell flat. Every move he made to regain control was quietly undermined by the presence of the people we had subtly positioned. They didn't need to confront him aggressively. Their calm confidence and Ellie's visible accomplishment were doing all the work. And then it got even better. One of Jenna's subtle interventions took effect. She leaned into a few older relatives who had always nodded along with Mark, whispering reminders of past events that contradicted his narrative. Instances of neglect, selfishness, broken promises. I didn't hear every word, but I saw the result. Skeptical glances, silent frowns, and finally, the faintest murmurs of "I didn't realize" spreading across the circle. Mark, for the first time, realized he was standing on shaky ground. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Everything unfolded without me having to raise my voice. I simply held Ellie's hand, smiled at her quietly, and let the carefully cultivated momentum carry us forward. The backyard, which had been a stage for his performance, was now a gallery showcasing the real story, one of responsibility, consistency, and quiet leadership, contrasted against empty promises and entitlement. By late afternoon, the pattern was clear to everyone. Mark tried a few final desperate maneuvers, suggesting games and activities for the kids, claiming to make it up to Ellie with prizes, with words. But the adults around him had seen enough. They were polite, patient, and most importantly, unimpressed. Some even offered mild congratulations to Ellie in his presence, drawing more attention to her achievements. Each acknowledgement was a subtle but undeniable confirmation that Mark's pedestal was no longer stable. Jake, my nephew, had sensed the shift too. He tried a few antics, some minor disruptions, attempting to reclaim attention through noise. But with Ellie surrounded by allies and appreciated by adults, his actions drew quiet reprimands, not the laughter he expected. He looked confused, frustrated, and then finally deflated, a direct consequence of the environment we had cultivated. He wasn't being punished aggressively. He was just learning that the chaos he thrived in didn't dominate every space. I noticed Mark glancing around, his face red, lips pressed in a thin line. The simmering frustration and rising panic were visible, and it was strangely satisfying to witness. He realized, fully, that this wasn't a single embarrassing moment. It was a public exposure of a pattern, undeniable and carefully constructed, and nothing he could do in that moment would fully undo it. He tried to salvage the situation, but every effort only drew attention to Ellie, to the allies, and to the inconsistencies in his previous boasts. Ellie, in the meantime, was glowing. She had painted something beautiful, and for the first time, I could see her feel genuinely proud in front of a crowd that wasn't dismissive. The joy in her eyes reflected back to me and reminded me why every late-night plan, every whispered consultation, every careful recruitment of allies had been worth it. She wasn't just participating, she was thriving, and she felt seen. By the time the event wound down, Mark had retreated to the shade of the house, muttering excuses about needing a break, a cold drink, or a reason to leave. Lisa hovered, uncertain, perhaps realizing for the first time that her usual tactics of minimizing conflict and excusing bad behavior no longer worked. Even the relatives who had previously nodded along now looked at him with faint disapproval. The performance he had relied on for years, the one that insulated him from scrutiny, had collapsed quietly but completely. Ellie hugged me, shy and smiling, whispering, "Dad, everyone liked my painting." I ruffled her hair and whispered back, "I know, kiddo. You did amazing." That moment, small and ordinary, felt like the culmination of months of strategy, months of rebuilding confidence, months of resisting the urge to react emotionally and instead act with precision. It was the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from shouting or winning a fight. It comes from seeing justice unfold calmly, inevitably, and publicly. We packed up to leave, and as we walked to the car, I noticed Mark standing still in the driveway, watching us go. His mouth moved, probably forming words, but no one around him seemed to pay attention. The collapse was complete. The quiet victory was perfect. He hadn't been humiliated with loud accusations, but everyone had seen clearly what kind of behavior he had fostered and how it had been quietly corrected through preparation, allies, and simple, undeniable truth. In the car, Ellie leaned her head on my shoulder, tired but radiant. "Dad," she said, "was that good?" "It was perfect," I said, kissing her hair. "You did everything right." And I meant it. This wasn't about my ego or revenge. It was about showing her that fairness and dignity could prevail, and that people who choose cruelty and entitlement cannot escape accountability forever. That night, as I tucked her into bed, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Not only had the immediate injustice been addressed, But Ellie and I had both gained something bigger, a reaffirmation of our self-worth, a demonstration of careful, deliberate action, and the knowledge that standing firm quietly, with allies and preparation, can be more powerful than shouting. Mark's empire of entitlement had been quietly dismantled in plain sight, and there was nothing he could do to rebuild the illusions he had relied on for so long. The ripple effect was already beginning. People who had once deferred to him now looked at him differently. Even his allies, the ones who had nodded along to his boasts, now had subtle doubts. And for me, watching Ellie sleep peacefully, I knew that no party, no entitled family member, no act of disregard could ever take that away. We had survived, we had rebuilt, and we had quietly won. Because sometimes, the most satisfying victories aren't the loudest. They're the ones that leave your enemies wondering exactly how it happened, while you and the people you love stand taller, stronger, and undeniably triumphant. And in that quiet, victorious moment, I smiled, knowing that this was the first of many days where Ellie and I would always come first, and no entitled behavior would ever shadow us again.